Welcome into another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
I'm your other host, James or Jexic. And today we don't have a guest, but we're going to be talking about tier lists for Wave 5. So we're going to be going in release order through all the factions, placing them in tiers from S all the way down to C.
Everybody's favorite topic, tier lists. It's been a hot topic in the community of late. We'll see where all your favorite factions land and why you think we're wrong.
As a general rule, like we've got S tier decks are just like they don't have too many bad matchups, if at all, and like they have a lot of tools for a lot of situations, and they're just pretty robust factions. Then we've broken the A tier down into 3, which basically means we think the game is quite balanced. You have a bit of diversion in the high to the low, and some of the decks are maybe a little more consistent or a little more powerful. B and C decks are either they're just really inconsistent at times, or just like struggling in some key way that makes it tough for them to compete, but there's still players that can do quite well with them here and there. Do you have anything else to add to that, Aaron?
The B tier, like you said, is struggling a little to compete. Like they're missing one aspect of their game has like a hole that sets them back from being extremely competitive. C tier needs the most work, obviously. Is the least competitive, but still can win games. Like even C tier still can be competitive, win some games.
I could hand some of the best players of the C tier deck against one of my decks, and I'd probably still lose. The player skill still matters a lot in this game, no matter which faction you choose, it seems like.
All right, do we want to hop into it with the Breakers?
The first initial release was like Breakers versus Cave Goblins. We got the Breakers in A- tier. I mean, the big thing with them is that a lot of people recognize is that like the range is an advantage, but it also, like when your whole deck is ranged, your damage can be a little inconsistent and tough to rely on at times.
Yeah, and you do have a couple ways to mitigate that a little bit with like Blast and like pushing with Deceivers, but Breakers do also struggle a little bit when you get up in their face and they don't have that ability to like keep you at bay and stay at range. So they can't punish as near as much as like a Phoenix Elves if you get up in your face, or like even a Fallen Kingdom if you get up in their face. So they have that part of their game that is a little weaker.
It has been interesting to see new players take them up. Water D had a very opinionated stance on how they should be played, but now like Dead Sands, the top Breakers player, plays them a bit more aggressively. So they definitely have options and can do cool things.
Yeah, and we've seen like Massimo dominate with the Breakers in tournaments, bringing out champions that people don't ever use, like Galwork and Kalal, which is a champion that's used a little more now, but not as much. People tend to go for Gul'dun. But Breakers are definitely a very viable faction, but yeah, A- tier for them.
And then next up, we have one of my favorite factions to play, Cave Goblins. We have them at B, and that's just, I think, because as good as they are when they have everything going, like you can lose to them and feel like you never had a chance. But it requires a lot of things to go right in terms of their card draw, like getting gates at the right time and not getting flooded with events. Sometimes they can be their own worst enemy in terms of just the way you get your cards and how the order works.
And there's a couple factions that they really, really struggle against. Like, for example, the Crimson Order or the Fungal Dwarves or even the Fallen Kingdom, which is not as bad of a matchup for them. But factions like that and
also factions that can deal extra out-of-combat damage, like the Phoenix Elves, decks like that can just pick away at their guys, make it hard for them to survive. So,
yeah. They do have the ability to steamroll almost any deck, even like Crimson Order if you get the right draw, but it is so like draw dependent. You really need to have that go right for you in certain matchups to have a chance, and in other matchups to do well. So they're one of the most draw dependent, like you were saying, James, decks in the game, and that plays a factor quite a bit with them.
Next up, we're going to look at essentially what looked like a pair in the original decks, which is the Fallen Kingdom. We've got Fallen Kingdom. This is kind of one that might change over time, but we've got Fallen Kingdom in the A- tier. They recently had a major change to Blood Summon, and at first, for a while, they were probably one of the worst decks that ever existed when the Blood Summon was just changed and nothing else was given. But now, Reptiles has 14 health, Goldass has a buff. Suddenly, they seem like a pretty viable deck, and I could see them even going up from A-, but we've got them there for now. Because they still kind of have some draw dependency issues like the Cave Goblins, in that like if you get Blood Summon with no units, or if you get Purge with no other units that you actually want to purge, they can suffer from some draw dependency issues. They're a lot harder to assassinate than they used to be. Like having extra health also gives them a better econ game. So I think they've improved a noticeable amount.
Yeah, I definitely think they've improved, but they haven't really improved in their worst faction matchups. Like their struggle before the changes were like that they didn't have enough reach. and they lost a tiny bit of reach with the Blood Summon change, but they also just didn't gain any reach with any of the changes. Like, they're all good changes that help them a little bit in their power level, but none of them help some of their worst matchups. So when you're struggling against a faction that has a lot of reach, Cloaks, Savannah Elves, Sand Goblins, Deepwood Groaks, Shadow Elves, these factions that can really keep you at bay, they will struggle to approach. And if they can't get to you, or get like a good Blood Summon going, if your cards don't line up there, then you're going to struggle in that matchup, and that's part of why they're in A- and not higher yet. But that's what I've seen with them.
Speaking of decks that have had changes and we're putting in A minus, next up is the Vanguards. They've obviously improved from where they were because they've got a Jacob buff as well as mass heal has improved, but still seeing reports of people not always playing the mass heals even though they cost 0. And so it's just like, is it enough to really catapult them way to the top? It seems uncertain at this point. Although I know like some players like Alcanella and others are saying that they've had good success with them. So that's another faction to watch, I'd say.
Yeah, we've definitely seen some success from some of the players who play them quite a bit, and they definitely are better than they were. I think they're probably going to end up somewhere in like A minus, but neither of us have played them a whole lot since the changes, so this one definitely could be subject to change after we get a better feel for them.
Continue with the master set. We've got Polar Dwarves. Got them in A, and I think it's just, I mean, Aaron could probably say better, but they just are tough to take down, and they will often just grind through and win games. You might think you're assassinating them and you got them stuck, but then they can kind of step back, put a parapet, put a gate, put an ice golem, and suddenly like you can't get to them anymore, and they're just going to grind you down.
Yeah, they have a very good econ game. They have some of the best champs in the game. Jarmund is phenomenal, and Nediana and Olag are no slouches. There's a lot of ability for them to go to the long game, and once they go to the long game, they have a chance to win it against almost any faction. Their biggest weakness is they don't have an ability to do a lot of damage to a summoner without it being a bit telegraphed. So their only high damage output to summoners is like Ice Smiths, putting them under bears or putting them under ice golems. And because they only have that one aspect and you can see it coming, it is easy to avoid like being high damaged hit by the Polar Dwarves. But they have so many good cards to kind of outlast you, like the Parapets and like Ice Repair and Ice Golems and Jarmund, that if you can't get around that, they definitely can compete with basically any deck.
Lastly, to finish off the master set, we have the Savannah Elves, who are our first faction that we're going to put in the S tier. Now, they recently had some changes. They went down to 4 strength on a Buashi, and they changed their starting setup. But those changes in general are probably kind of a wash, and the Savannah Elves are still a very strong faction. They have enough offensive power that makes some deck building decks jealous. They have a good range game when the Border Archers, like, and they're not that draw dependent. All kinds of their, like, they are magic hungry enough that they can discard anything for magic pretty much and then use it. They have solid champs aside from Meaty Mumway, but they're never getting to 8 magic anyway, so their one bad card doesn't really affect them in a negative way. It's a solid all around deck that has few bad matchups.
Yeah, and I don't know any other deck in the game really, and maybe I'm missing one, but there's not really another deck in the game that can throw the amount of dice that Savannah Elves can throw. Like, if you chant a power the right unit, and you can off one attack, if it's like a Border Archer or if it's entangled with a Border Archer, you can throw 15 dice, and that's just one of your 3 attacks. The amount of dice that the Savannah Elves can throw is life-threatening to every summoner in the game, and that's just off with the one attack, besides maybe the Chosen Grove, but we'll get to them later. But yeah, they're a very strong deck. They don't have really any weaknesses besides like Mini Mumway, and they do well against almost every faction. So,
all right, so now moving on, we'll go to the starter set decks. First up, the Phoenix Elves. We've got them at A minus. They've been buffed, but it still didn't put them like in meteoric or like super high tier. They're just a solid deck. You could definitely underestimate them if you let them do what they want, which is to kind of play their game and keep away and keep their gates up and just, even though she's got 9 health, it can be hard to get to her sometimes. Yeah, we got them in an A minus.
yeah, and they're one of the better defensive factions, but they can be used very aggressively also. They have that versatility. And I personally am not the best Phoenix Elves player, but I've definitely seen people like do very, very well with them. and they, after the changes, have some strong abilities that they can make use of. But that 9 health is always a factor.
From that same set, still an A minus, we've got Tundra Orcs. Tundra Orcs moved up in estimation over time a bit, just because they're just an honest deck. And we talked earlier saying Savannah Elves are one of the few decks that can throw as many dice as they do. But with 4 Glory, the Tundra Orcs can do a pretty good impression there. And they just won't surprise you very often. And they have a few bad cards, like Freeze isn't very great, and Fighters aren't that great in most cases. You know, you're kind of discarding your cards to get their champions, which are solid, but not broken, aside from maybe Shonk being like very good. They do pretty well against decks that want to assassinate them because they're just tough to assassinate at 14 health. The worst thing with Tundra Orcs is just being overconfident and getting Grognak stuck, which I think a lot of players still have to work on. But at the high level, we see players like Nestle still doing quite well with them.
Yeah, Nestle's definitely changed my view a bit on the Tundra Orcs. They're definitely a faction that can like bully some decks and do really well, but their lack of a consistent like range game can be a detriment in against some factions, because then you need like Grognak up close and personal, and some factions can punish you quite well for that. But overall, I think they're definitely better than I used to think.
Next up, we've got the Cloaks. This is another entry into the S tier. Even though they've been nerfed, like we changed hand cannon so that it cannot be placed on melee units, which means you can no longer put a moto boot and a hand cannon on your machinist and just park it in the back row. But ultimately what that means is that hand cannon is still an okay card to put on snipers and gunners, and the faction I think is still very difficult to play around everything it can do. And if your opponent's spending all their time worrying about what you're going to do, they're not going to be in as good positions. And then even if you're not playing aggressive with them, they have great keep away with the gunners and the machinists and things like that. So they're good at playing range, and they're good at punishing people who encroach in their territory that are getting tired of being kept away. So just a solid deck.
Yeah, they can be aggressive, they can play ranged, they can deal with aggression for the most part. They have a lot of different abilities, and some of their champs are some of the best in the game. Like Dagger is no slouch, and the Admiral and Sinsin are both pretty good as well.
Next up, we've got the Sky Spirit Avians. We have them as solid A up next to the Polar Dwarves, essentially. They're definitely very flexible in the way they can play. They can kind of play a decent range game. They can go aggro. I think the only thing that kind of holds them back maybe is that Ava only has 10 health, so you got to be a little careful with her. But they have extra gates, which gives them consistency in terms of where they're summoning from. They're just a solid deck that has a shot against a lot of decks.
They do pretty well in a fair amount of matchups. They have an ability to either dive in or just sit back and poke, giving that like versatility. Another thing I think that the deck struggles a little bit with is cost. All their units cost a fair amount. Their commons, sometimes you have to pick and choose which ones you want to get out, but they still do pretty well with just having like 1 or 2 commons out most of the time.
Now we'll move on to the Eternal Council. We've got them in A tier as well, but kind of towards the bottom of it. When everything's going great, they can feel really powerful. But, sometimes they can be a bit draw dependent despite drawing a lot of cards. You might not get your events or the things in the right order. Mind Knight isn't always like a great econ unit. People can just kind of avoid it, even though it seems really stifling. There's ways to go around it. Katu, as good as it is, it's not necessarily the game plan you want to wait all the way till the end and then hope Katu can make you win. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, Katu is a very strong end game, but it's also very situational. We talk about a lot of other champs being situational, but I don't feel it like comes out as much against Katu. It is super situational because it has to be the end game for Katu to be good. Like Katu can't be used almost anywhere else in the game and be worth the magic. Ovi is still a solid champ, but besides that, Edia doesn't really have the support to push her like into A plus or S tier. However, throwing 8 dice and having the ability to steal your opponent's events can lead to quite a bit of really strong matchups and really strong moves in the Eternal Council game. So they definitely have a lot of versatility in that aspect, in which they can use your best events against you as long as they make sense. And sometimes they can use your best events or your worst events if they're better for them, better than you can. For example, the Savannah Elves have Chant of Weaving. It's better in the Eternal Council than it is in the Savannah Elves. And it can stay up as long as you want. Or like Blinding Flare for the Phoenix Elves. It's better in the Eternal Council when they steal it from you than it is in the Phoenix Elves, and they can keep it up for as long as they want, as long as they have enough boosts. That can really change the dynamics of matchups, and when used correctly, that alone can really shift how strong they are.
And then to finish off wave 2, we've got the Fungal Dwarves, which are one of Aaron's favorite factions. I guess I could let him talk about them, but we've got them in B tier today.
Yeah, the fungal dwarves have fallen a bit from grace. They at one point they were probably like S tier or at least A plus tier, up towards those top like 5 or so factions. They got nerfed a little bit, -1 health to full deck, and there were some changes to how the cards worked. It really didn't pull them that far down. It probably pulled them down to like a minus tier, maybe like bottom of A tier, pulled them towards the middle of the pack. They were all right. But what's really hurt the Fungal Dwarves is the last 6 to 8 decks that have been released all do really well against the Fungal Dwarves. They didn't have near as many bad matchups, and then you bring in like Storm Goblins and Spectral Conclave, and these are like 2 of their worst matchups. They're like 80% against the Fungal Dwarves. You throw in a couple more that are all like 60% or like pretty close, and it's just tough for the Fungal Dwarves out there right now. And then you add in the factor of like they're maybe the first or second most, with Cave Goblins being the other one, like draw dependent deck in the game. If you don't draw beasts or you don't draw carriers, it can really not allow you to start your engine. So there's a lot of factors in there, and those matchup factors are a big part of why they're no longer in like the middle tier for me, and they're down in B tier.
All right, now it's time for the Fast and the Furious. We've got the Obsidian Dwarves start off wave 3, and we've got them in B tier as well. They can be one of the scariest decks around, but sometimes the dice or draw pile can just make it hard for you. Like, they're very dependent on certain styles of play to really want Devura in or Volcor, and if you just have your champions towards the bottom, like, you could be discarding all this magic for no benefit if you don't get those cards in time. You need boosts to make Volcanic Blast work. It's one of the best events in the game, but if your dice just aren't cooperating to give you Volcanic Blast, the only guaranteed ones in the deck are like the 2 willpowers. So if you just have like really bad rolls, you can just be kind of sunk out for a bit. I think you can usually kind of like hang tough and like put guards out and sort of wait until you get your boosts, but it's still, you know, a tough road sometimes, which makes them less consistent than some of the top decks.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And like you were saying, they are like maybe one of the most dice dependent decks in the game. If you're rolling too many specials, then Balzar is just not having a good time, and that can really affect how the deck plays, because that's your engine for a lot of different things, for the dice for Balzar, for pulling in some of your units, for playing some of your units. So it really just changes the whole dynamic of the game and can prevent you from having a good game plan.
You can have those explosive games where you just blow up anybody and it feels great. I still think you should play OD. They're fun, but if it's like a tournament where you had a lot of on the line, then it could be, you might think twice.
And we have seen a couple players really do quite well with them, but they just are more dice dependent than most of the other decks.
Like I said, we had the Fast and the Furious pair. The other half is the Sand Goblins, which are next entry in the S tier. They don't look like much with 10 health on their summoner and only 3 attack, and none of their units have very great stats, really. But they are just so plucky. They always find a way to win, and they're good at playing at range, despite not having the best range units, because they can just kind of poke you with a little wrench rat and then stick it under their gate and just kind of beg you to come at them. And if you come to their side of the field, you're pretty much toast if they have the right hand. They can just summon silts, they can detonate stuff, they can use, you know, thrusters to hit and run. A good strategy for the long term, and like they can get a really good econ through detonate. They place a lot of pressure on the opponent to attack and can still punish that pressure, similar to cloaks.
Yeah, and they have some of that automatic damage output that can be really, really like detrimental. They can get like a big wrench rat biter on you, or like a rust rider or whatever they want to detonate next to you. That can just end your game plan right there. And using the super gate is always like a pretty good game plan and can really work for the econ. But even just like if you have thrusters on Sparks and Crust, like you can be in a spaghetti western just firing down lines and winning duels nonstop and then thrusting away. So they really have a lot of different tools and a lot of different versatility to win even some of their not as good matchups. They just don't really have a whole lot of not great matchups.
Now we'll move on to Shadow Elves, which are another S tier deck, just because they have great range game. They have great econ. And they have the ability to assassinate players that advance against them. They're a little fragile against the rush against certain types of decks, but overall they're a very strong deck and don't have too many bad matchups at all. The only thing that's a little weird is that some of the best players of them have kind of went away from the community for a bit, so we don't see as much examples of it, but we do know the Shadow Elves are one of the best decks.
Yeah, eventually the rest of us will unlock that puzzle of the Shadow Elves, but I don't know when that'll be. But the Shadow Elves at the highest level are so dominant. I've seen them beat basically every deck, and even when they're not played at like the very highest level, they can be very competitive with basically every deck. They have not a ton of damage output, but they have a pretty consistent damage output. And if you get your summoner down to like 7 health against the Shadow Elves, it's probably game over.
Next up, we have the Wayfarers. We've got them at A+, kind of a controversial deck for a while just because people kind of think that they have a very limited strategy and that they have to go for the summoner. There's two things about that. One, going for the summoner is how you end up winning the game. You don't need to necessarily win on points or something like in another game. And the second part is they actually are a bit more robust than that, and that they can play pretty well defensively with dancers and boldo and other tricks that they have. The only thing I will say that is a potential weakness of them is that if you get to extreme end game situations and you weren't ahead, it can be a problem because Celeste alone will lose to most other summoners 1v1. So you kind of have to prevent that from happening. But otherwise, they're really strong and they have great matchups into a lot of the other top decks. That's why we've got them at A+.
Originally, people thought that if built a wall and like blocked them from getting out that like boost on Celeste's attack when units get to the other side of the battlefield, that they would just not do well. But we've seen a lot of people be able to win never going to the other side of the battlefield. It really has changed like the mindset on Wayfarers, and they are pretty versatile. They can, like you said, go after your summoner, and they do very well at that. But they can even play like a longer econ game if they get like one or both there. Seek the Horizons. That's 6 cards essentially that you didn't have beforehand, so they can summon like 6 extra common units, and that can be really, really good if you're trying to outlast somebody.
The last couple decks in Wave 3. First to the High Elves. We've got them in A+ as well. Seems to be a theme so far for Wave 3. Art of Breeze has kind of been saying that High Elves are underrated and they're a bit underplayed, and the public data shows that they don't have the highest win rates, but they just have so many tools and so many things to move around that they can just be really tough. And they've got some great units in the Peace Arbiter and some of the other ones that solid range game. Like their range game can beat some of the very best decks. And then they can also play very well aggressively or just move forward and kind of take over the middle of the board with a Valeria. So they're just a strong deck.
Yeah, they have quite a few tricks up their sleeve. Their range game is phenomenal, like you were saying. Having a Peace Arbiter out there with like 3 attack from a war or even 4 from like loyalty or something can give them a huge attack buff. And then when you try and retaliate, they have tough. So it's tough to like take that on and try and win that range trade. But they're also very good if they get up in your face, because like you were saying, Valeria can really take care of like common units. But if you get like Titus out, or even if you have Cassia in the back of your line, you can really outlast a lot of people or like push people around with Titus and do a lot of damage. They have quite a bit of versatility to their game plans, and they're tough to approach and they're tough to let sit back. So one of the best defensive factions in the game, and they're hard to get around.
Lastly, from that wave, we have the Swamp Orcs, which we also have an A+. Aaron recently won the Tournament of Champions with them, beating lots of strong decks. So maybe he could talk a bit more about them.
Yeah, I even before I played them in the Tournament of Champions, I've always felt the Swamp Orcs have been like a pretty strong deck. I've seen Vexer and some of the other top players do really well with them. But yeah, in the Tournament of Champions, I won the entire thing and I didn't drop a game with the Swamp Orcs. And they have not as much options as the other high up decks in our tier list, but they can hit so hard that sometimes it doesn't matter. If you can like bide your time and build your swamp and really get that mug attack super high, it's tough to deal with, and they can one shot. Like we were just talking about the high elves being tough to deal with their arbiters of peace, but Mug can one shot those easily, and then you throw in like bog witches and stuff of that nature to do 2 attacks, and you can get extra champs out with a merge, and they throw a lot of dice, and it's almost all melee, so it's super, super consistent. So that is their benefit. And they also, not many factions can do this, can heal their summoner. So they can regenerate Mug up to like 6 health in a game. So that gives it even a harder time for people trying to take down that swamp.
Moving on to wave 4, we've got the Crimson Order. We have them in the A tier. It's one of those decks that a lot of people complain about it because they don't like the style. Kind of drags games out, but ultimately you can learn how to play around them a bit or play decks that are just better at getting to Crimson Order. At the higher level, they don't seem to be as dominant. So they're closer to 50% in terms of a deck when you factor in people being as strong as players. They just don't feel as broken, definitely, and they don't have as many tricks as some of the other top tier decks. So that's why we've got them in A tier.
Yeah, the Crimson Order, their econ game might be the best of maybe any deck in the game. It's definitely up there. But the problem is they are a bit one-dimensional, which is why I don't think they're above the A tier. They don't have the movement to really get around the board and compete with a lot of the factions. They struggle with some factions quite a bit. There's not a whole lot they can do against those factions, whether it's Storm Goblins or a couple different factions. Huge blind spots in the Crimson Order game. And so that really prevents them from being in the top 2 tiers, in my opinions. They're still a strong deck, but they have their weaknesses, and that holds them back.
Next to them, and also in the A tier, we've got the Mountain Vargath. Mountain Vargath are interesting in that whenever we try to come up with an even matchup, if you just put the Mountain Vargath in, the matchup's even. It's just like they don't have many good, they don't have any great, and they don't have any terrible matchups like at all. It's hard to find one. They're just a solid deck. They have a lot of tools, but they're also not going to surprise you too much aside from the occasional Varn or like Martial Forces play. So really grind it out and have a good slugfest, and it's going to be honest and it'll be fun. Solid deck.
Yeah, they definitely are, like you said, every matchup's one you can win, every matchup's one you can lose. But they do very well in having the ability to change their game plan, whether it's going to Torridon and like trampling through stuff, or staying back and like poking with like Quen. They have a lot of options, and Thunderbite adding dice to everything just makes them a little more consistent in every matchup, which is helpful. So yeah, A tier for them.
Next up in that wave, we've got the Deepwood Groaks. Now, last time we had them in SS tier because they were just above and beyond some of the other decks, but now we've got them in the A tier. Tweak to Hecataya to not only change her starting setup to be better, but also to change her special ability to only work in the magic phase. So it greatly reduces the amount of shenanigans you can pull in the turn, and you have to kind of telegraph your moves a bit more. But, we had Magnifico on the podcast a while ago. You should check that one out. And he said he thinks they're still a solid deck. They've got a lot of good options, and so we've got them in A tier. The Seer, once you get it powered up, is still a pain in the neck. They've got a lot of interesting, unique things to do with the potions and some of their other units and their boost generation, so they're still to be looked out for, but they're just no longer a broken, unfun deck, essentially.
Yeah, they do have a lot of different tools they can use. Their champs are all really good also, and they're all pretty cheap, with 5 being the most that they have to pay for a champ. They have a lot of ability to use range game or get some high melee attacks in there. So they can really change their game plan based off how other people are approaching them. And like you said, those seers are still super tough to deal with for most factions. Most factions don't have a way to get through to that back line and really deal with those seers. So they are still pretty strong, but I think they're at a very good level now for that deck.
Next up, we've got the Forged, which we've pushed down to A- tier. And I think it's just because maybe some of the more recent matchups and in general, it's just like they can do a lot, but they also only have 10 health for their summoner. So he's just kind of vulnerable at times. And he doesn't have the mobility and, that's something like a Sand Goblins might have, with that 10 health. They still can play very well aggressively. And we've even seen some people play them more like extreme defensively with Exile recently. So maybe there's still more to be explored with them, and we'll see.
Yeah, there's definitely the ability to play like super aggressive with the Forge. That's how most people play. But the defensive side is a little more unexplored. And so we'll be curious to see as people figure that out if they move up in our tiers or where they go. But they're still a very strong deck. They have very consistent damage with that Forged in Flames that the Inventor has. But the problem with that is the Inventor has to be there. So the inventor has to be in the fray, and a fair amount of decks can take advantage of that. It's tough for the Forge to deal with like the Swamp Orcs and the Drake Sun and the Storm Goblins and avoid like some of those decks that can really take advantage of being in the fray there.
Next up, we've got the Shimmersea Fae, which are our only entry into the C tier at this point in time. A lot has to go right for you to win with them, it seems like, or you have to really know them very well. And they're just not as strong as some of the other decks overall. Their game plan's less consistent. A lot of times you'll be playing and you'll get through your deck with how quickly you've been drawing, and your opponent still has 10 cards left, and you might get blocked out and unable to finish the job. I mean, maybe that's a little oversimplification, and I know like the Beast Slumbers has tried to say you can play Econ with them and go against the grain, but they lack some of the tools that other decks do, and some of their events and other cards aren't always worth the card play.
If you just look at their cards in a vacuum, their common units without any of their buffs or not getting any of their bonuses to go off are like 3 of them have 2 attack. And that's just not going to cut it in the Econ game. And their one that has 3 attack only has 2 health and is a very good card. But if you don't have the Econ working for you with like getting champs out and buffing some of those units and getting those swarms off really well, then Shimmersea Fae are pretty one-dimensional, and they can still surprise some people. They can still get up in your face and be hard to deal with and really surprise some people, but they don't normally have that ability to go in the long game, especially if they aren't getting those buffs from some of their units.
Finally, to finish off Wave 4, we've got the Storm Goblins. We have them in A- tier. I mean, I haven't played them as much, so maybe I'll let Aaron take over here.
Yeah, the Storm Goblins are an interesting one. They have some of the most polarizing matchups, I feel like. We did think they were like maybe the most polarizing faction in the game, and then another faction that we'll talk about in a little bit came later. But they have some faction matchups. They just dominate because they can just zap through all your units. But if they play against some of those like higher health factions, whether it's Tundra Orcs, Chosen Grove, or some of those factions that really can change how Storm Goblins have to play, then they struggle with it. And they don't have a whole lot of other options. They don't have like high damage output besides the like electrocution stuff in their deck. And so if they can't get that to work, they're a bit more one-dimensional. But they can be very strong when it is working. And it is fairly easy against most factions to get it to work. And a lot of factions really struggle against them because they can just zap damage through everything. Like the Phoenix Elves with their 9 health is really tough to play against the Storm Goblins. They do have a lot of really good matchups, but they have a lot of matchups that are just not impossible, but very difficult for them to win, whether it's Polar Dwarves or Tundra Orcs.
So now we'll move on to the latest wave. So this is all new content because we didn't talk about them in the last tier list. First up, we've got the Chosen Grove will be next. So Chosen Grove we've got in A-. Tree is big. It's got 20 health, but it is a limitation that it cannot move where you want it to sometimes. Knight of Seasons is one of the best champions in the game, but again, you got to get up to that 6 magic and you got to do that. They're a bit more rigid in their playstyle, and some people like having a game plan like that, but others kind of like to be more fluid. So they are good against a lot of assassination decks because they just have so much health that it's tough to take them down. We just talked about Storm Goblins. Like, okay, you're going to zap me for 1 every turn. Who cares? I've got 20 health. Yeah, and they're definitely like a fun one to hand players that they just want to have the biggest thing there is in the game. There's a Chosen Grove for you.
I do think there's like some of the matchups that they really struggle with, or not even matchups necessarily. Sometimes it's just like game plan because, like you said, the tree is unable to move except for like if you have an uproot or towards the end of the game once your deck runs out. You can just get stuck in positions that you can't get out of. Like I had a game against Massimo in the league a season or 2 ago, and I rolled poorly to clear a blocker that he had placed like very first turn in front of my tree, and I missed my rolls, and after that I just couldn't get out of that spot. He always had somebody in the front of the tree. I never drew an uproot. Went through like over half my deck, unable to do anything to the game plan that he had done, which was great on his part to just get up in my face and then prevent me from trying to do anything to that forward blocker on the front of the tree. And then they do have a couple tools to deal with this, like you can pull stuff with some of their units or replace spots with the Stag or like Autumn. But if the opposing faction also has the ability to spot steal, like the Vargath do, it can be very, very difficult to deal with that as the tree. Just something to be wary of. And they're still pretty strong in most matchups, but there are some that they really struggle with.
Next up, we have another entry into the S tier with the Filth. They might be the strongest deck in the game by the data and the general public perception. Their whole theme is to have a tool for every situation, and with Volatile Flesh being able to just search for that tool, or Mutagus being able to search it back from the discard pile, they almost always can do something good against your deck. So you just kind of have to wait it out. And there's some debate now. People are saying that maybe the Abomination is one of the strongest champs in the game, but also is one of the highest investments in the game, requiring 7 magic and lots of extra cards to go under as mutation. If this is going to be the strongest deck in the game, it doesn't bother me that much because I think the games are still interesting and dynamic and fun. It's not like they just hang back. They tend to often go aggressive and go for your summoner. But again, like with Volatile Flesh, they can get those double attacks in pretty easily and like kind of surprise you, like fly over with a winged mutant, Volatile Flesh, hit you for a bunch. So much like facing the Shadow Elves or the Cloaks, your summoner isn't really safe at like 6 or 7 health almost anywhere.
Yeah, and because they have all those tools, like you were saying, they really don't have any bad matchups. They can deal with everybody from the Cave Goblins, who can surprise some of the higher tier decks sometimes. They can outlast some of the Shadow Elves or like the Cloaks. An Abomination is a very solid game plan, one of the best champs in the game, I think, to fall back on, as long as you can support it with those different mutants that you can get out and really buff that ability. But overall, just a very strong deck, and they have a couple different game plans they can really lean on and helps them win most situations.
Continuing on with this wave, we've got the Isle Vekid, which we've got in the A plus tier, similar to like the High Elves with the tough units at range. You know, you can do that with their summoner and like use the battle dancers or the other units. They have a good range game, but if you come into their territory, they can Waveborn Relic and just ping pong your summoner around or whatever else is up there. Even if you don't have Waitui in your hand, if you manage to build 8 magic, you have a huge threat to your opponent that is existential. So, like if you ignore it and just get killed by Waitui, it's on you. But if you also just spend your whole time playing around Waitui, it can be tough too. The Isle Vekid are just a tough faction, and their commons are good, and they can all help buff their summoner to do good things too.
Yeah, they just have a lot of versatility because their summoner can take the abilities of all those common units, and their champs are all pretty good. Waitui is the one that people look at the most because of that crazy stat line, but even their other 2 champs are pretty solid. Sokka being the better one and probably the one that gets the most play, the 3 cost. But they just do very well against most factions. They can really like dance around. They don't have a lot of bad matchups. They're kind of similar to Bargath in that way. And we've seen a lot of the top players really do well with them. And in my opinion, they're super fun to play. I don't even always do the Y2E explosion that some people do, but even with just their commons, they're so much fun to play.
And next up from that same release and in the same tier, we have the Spectral Conclave at A+. For anybody facing the Spectral Conclave, they are one of the most annoying decks to face just because of the Depart ability. It changes your own movement phase to the point where like you have to play differently against them, right? If you move next to one of their units, it just goes back to their discard, and then they can summon it again with that boost. Even if you spend the whole game completely avoiding Depart, like you never trigger Depart the whole time, they still have up to 4 boosts they can get between Fade Away and Unleash. So you can't completely stop them from doing that. The thing that I struggle with is doing a lot of direct damage to one thing without Unleash, because a lot of their units just have 2 strength. The other thing that holds them back is the fact that there are some decks that want to assassinate that little 11 health guy, and Depart allows them to do that more easily because they can just move, kill the thing, and then either steal the spot with some ability or just attack at that point. So they do have some of the best and worst matchups in the game, but overall they have more good matchups than bad.
They are one of the more polarizing factions as well with Storm Goblins. There's some factions, though, that just struggle so hard against the Spectral Conclave. Fungal Doors I mentioned earlier, but there's a fair amount. But they do have range factions. It's tough for them sometimes. But they can get to you in a lot of different ways, and they can do a lot of different game plans, whether it's poking or assassination or econ. So they do have a lot of that versatility. And zero cost units they're not a bad thing to have, and they have a lot of them.
The one other common, the Mind Mage, is like a whole other thing to play around in terms of what to worry about. So even their one unit that's not zero cost is solid.
Yeah, and if you get down to low health against Spectral Conclave between like Mind Mages and Ghost Walk and Unleash, like it's going to be very tough to stay alive.
Now, the latest two, we've got the Drakesun Rebellion. It's a bit early, but I think we're putting them in A tier right now. They definitely seem strong. They have a lot of options in terms of their mobility, and they're very fluid in terms of what they can do, and they can create a lot of pressure early. The one thing that seems to kind of keep them in check, though, is that there are two things, I guess. The one is like some unit with the mount ability to really get anything else to work. Like their whole deck revolves around being able to pick guys up and drop them off. And then the other half is that it seems like they got a lot on the board at the start, and they do, but between their 10 health summoner and the 10 health dragon, if you destroy either one of those, you basically win. Like you'll win later if you kill the dragon early most time, or if you just manage to assassinate Pyra, you can win that way too. And it can be tough for them to defend both of those if they're playing aggressively. If they hang back and just play range, then maybe they're giving up some of the early advantages they would get from that deck. Yeah, we've got them at A tier now, basically.
They are so aggressive, and they can do that really well, but Pyra and Brimstone only have so much health. And so they're going to drop eventually, and I've seen so many people dive in and then struggle to finish the kill or get that final bit. And sometimes you can switch game plans and do that with like Cole. That saved me in a couple of games, and Cole in himself actually really helps them in some matchups, like the Forged, different matchups that are really just tough to deal with. But he doesn't have a ton of health, and he loses the health at least every turn someone takes. They have a solid deck, and their commons are nothing special, but their events are pretty good, and their champs, there's 4 of them. They're the only deck in the game that can say that.
I know Shimmer Sea would love to be able to say that, right?
Yeah, Shimmer Sea would switch Brimstone in. I think that would be... They would love to have Brimstone in their starting setup. You do that, and then maybe Faye is like in a good power level. You put Brimstone in the starting setup. Drakesun is a very good deck. We'll see if they fluctuate. These last 2 decks are obviously newer, so a little more leeway in where they'll end up, but A tier for now.
Similarly, we've got the Guild Dwarves in A tier. They kind of give me like some mixture of Shadow Elves and Sand Goblins vibes in that they can bounce stuff to their hand and just do a lot of tricky things on their side of the board, but unlike those decks, I think they do not project power as well as some other decks. Now, I've seen some people kind of play them similar to the Forge, where they kind of just rush up and get in your face, and maybe that's a possible way to play them. But for now, I think we got them kind of in the middle at A tier in that they're a little clunkier, and it can be tough to get some of their combos going. But at the same time, they have a lot of health to chew through in all their structures and events and everything, so they seem like a solid deck.
Yeah, and when you whiff against the Guild Dwarf, sometimes it can be pretty tough to deal with, because whether you're leaving like a defender out on the battlefield or you're leaving a structure that Olden can pull back into their hand, then it really changes how the game is. So a couple of whiffs can really be harmful against the Guild Dwarves. Not something you can really control, but they do have a fairly strong defensive game plan, but they don't always have the ability to pressure as well as like the Forge do with that damage. So if you can keep them at bay, they can struggle to deal with a ranged attack as well. But they're a very strong deck, and they can do some solid auto damage with their ballistas and their defenders and their battling rams. And they can get those out fairly consistently as long as it's close to Olden where they need them. A tier for them.
That wraps up all the decks. After we release this, we'll post the little tier list shortly after and give everybody a chance to tell us how right or wrong we are.
Yeah, and I was just looking back at our past tier list just to see like which factions have moved the most. So our last tier list, some factions obviously were not a part of it, but the factions that were, the faction that moved the most was the Forged. They were A+ for us last time, and they're A- this time. Besides that, everybody else, they moved just like 1 tier, up or down. For the most part, we feel like the balance has been fairly consistent. So tell us why you disagree with us and which factions you think should be where, and then we'll post it, like James said, a little after the podcast. So we appreciate you guys hanging out for this tier list, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.